Thank you very much for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be part of this interesting series of lectures about something that is now 100 years ago, but as Richard said, is very topical and has caught people's imagination this last few months. I want to talk about the Great War and international memory. I'm going to move towards Britain in the later part of the lecture, but I want to begin by thinking about other countries as well. In the book that Richard mentioned, The Long Shadow, I have tried to develop three propositions. The first is that our attitudes to the Great War in this country and other countries have changed over time. There's nothing static about the way we understand that conflict. Secondly, I think that we in Britain, who often have a rather national-focused sense of history, benefit from understanding our history and our memory in a comparative perspective. In other words, thinking about our story in comparison with that of other countries. And thirdly, I think all the countries I'm going to talk about tonight, Britain and others, have understood the Great War, 1418, through the prism of the Second World War, 39-45. And those are the three propositions that, in a sense, will thread their way through this lecture. So if we start with a few other countries, how have they come to see the conflict of 1914-18, or whatever dates you put on it, because those dates are slightly different if one moves around Europe. First of all, let's start with the Soviet Union. Estimates of the Russian death toll in the war are very difficult to pin down. But a historian like Peter Gattrell, economic historian of social history and the migrations of the war, has suggested it's perhaps 2 million dead. This is comparable to the German figure. Of course, Germany's population was smaller than Russia's, but it's at least a striking point to bear in mind in purely numerical terms that the Russian death toll is that high. What is equally striking, as Catherine Merridale pointed out in her book Night of Stone, is that during the Soviet period, in other words from 1917 to 1991, there were no Soviet war memorials to the dead of 1914-17, Russia's First World War. 2 million dead, no war memorials. Think of the contrast with Britain, France, Australia, wherever you go. That war was blanketed out, whitened out of Soviet history because it was seen simply as an imperialist war, the trigger for the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, and then, of course, the prelude to a far more appalling conflict that followed the Civil War of 1917 to 22, in which perhaps 5 million Russians die. Contrast that with the Russian memory of what was called the Great Patriotic War of 1941 to 45. This became the legitimating myth of the Soviet state after Stalin, after Khrushchev. After Khrushchev had revealed the crimes of Stalinism, the way that the regime could justify itself under Leonid Brezhnev was by pointing to the heroic sacrifices of the people during the Great Patriotic War, led by the party leadership. And even now in Putin's Russia, you still have a very strong sense that that is the part of Russian history which is safe to talk about and is a source of pride. So for the Russians, although World War I has now become a topic of discussion in Russia, in modern Russia, and memorials have been put up, on the whole, it remains a neglected and a negative war compared to the overwhelmingly positive story of the Great Patriotic War of 41-45. Let's move on to the Americans. For the Americans, the Great War was a relatively short experience. It's 18 months from April 1917 to November 1918. If it had gone on longer, it might have been a different kind of story, but it doesn't engage the Americans in the same way. Indeed, in the 1930s, by the 1930s, this is regarded as a deeply mistaken enterprise to have got into this conflict, to have been sucked into Europe's war against the normal traditions of American foreign policy, going back to George Washington, and therefore something not to be done again. Those attitudes change a bit during the after Pearl Harbor, after America is catapulted into the next war. And by 1944, a movie about Woodrow Wilson, the president of who led America into the First World War, is a box office success. Wilson is presented as a far-sighted pioneer of a policy of internationalism that the Roosevelt administration is now adopting. But it's the Second War that is, of course, for the Americans overwhelmingly the good war, in the phrase popularized by Studs Terkel. It's become the focus in more recent years of adulation of what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation, those almost heroic Americans who took America through that war and on to a position of superpower status. The First World War, by comparison, is still somewhat of a neglected, a forgotten war, but it's seen in an essentially positive way now as, I think, a stepping stone to the supreme achievement of the 20th century, which is America, making America into a superpower in 1941-45. So a more sequential and positive narrative for the Americans. For France, we have a different story again. For the French, World War I involved the loss of 1.3 million Frenchmen, but it was and is still regarded as a noble sacrifice to cleanse the homeland of the German invasion, the German occupation. Remember that 10 French départements in the northeast are occupied by the Germans brutally, and the war is about redeeming French soil. It's also about regaining the two lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine that had been lost to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. So this is a noble sacrifice in the cause of reclaiming and redeeming the nation and the nation's soil. Contrast that with the Second War, which for the French remains a really problematic period in their history. The dark years, and les sombres, they're still known, when in 1940 the French army collapses in 4 weeks, having held out for 4 months, 4 years in 1914-18. It collapses in 4 weeks ignominiously. So that whereas 1.3 million Frenchmen die in the First World War, 1.8 million Frenchmen march off to German prisoner of war camps in June 1940. This isn't simply defeat, it is total humiliation for a country and its military tradition. Compounded by the complicity of the Vichy regime in the crimes of the Nazi era, the deportation of the Jews, the complicity in Nazi genocide. This is not a happy story in French history. It's no wonder that French politics for years were riven by divisions between collaborationists and résistants, collabos et résistants, a conflict that still rumbles on under the surface, particularly as the extent of Nazi genocide became apparent from the 1970s. So in France, you have a different story again. A positive, heroic First World War and a Second World War that is still very, very painful to talk about. Finally, Germany. I'm taking 4 examples, I take others, but Germany. In Germany, the Great War was presented at the time as a defensive war, which is perhaps hard for us to understand since we focus on France and Belgium. But from the German point of view, the way the war was presented was as a defense against the invasion by the Russians of Prussian territory in the east. The great German victory that was commemorated was Tannenberg, Hindenburg's defeat of the Russians in the summer of 1914. That's where the great German War Memorial is located, very different from Verdun for the French. And that perception of this as an essentially defensive war is, of course, accentuated in the Nazi period, but it is common to the German public as a whole. The elevation of Hindenburg as the great national hero in the 1920s and 1930s is very profound and widespread. The Second War is, of course, has to be acknowledged after 1945 as a major crime. Though initially a crime blamed on a few, a criminal few, who supposedly had misled and guided wrongly the German people. Gradually, there is a recognition of the extent to which German society as a whole had been intertwined with the Nazi project, had been complicit in it in all sorts of ways. But still, the view of the First World War as an essentially acceptable or justifiable war prevailed. That is until at least the 1960s, until Fritz Fischer, German professor, left-wing professor, gaining access to documents that had previously been in Soviet custody, had been released to the East German government, opening up with those documents and materials from the United States a very different view of Germany in the First World War, which suggested that Germany was engaged in an imperialist expansionist struggle with clear and aggressive war aims. And also, as Fischer developed his thesis in the 1960s, a strong sense that Germany, this was part of a continuity of German history that took you right back to Bismarck and was part of a problem of society in the view of him and his disciples, that had never really come to terms with modernity, that had been engaged, that was always tarnished by militarism, an incomplete democracy, and that militarism expressed itself in aggressive expansionism. That view is beginning to change now in Germany, or is at least a subject of intense debate, thanks to recent work that has been done. Chris Clark was here a few weeks ago. His book, Sleepwalkers, which has been a huge success in Germany and Austria, has had a big impact on that, shifting the blame away from Germany towards the Balkan countries, towards Russia. Similar arguments from other historians like Sean McMeekin in his book, July 1914. But still there is, in a sense, a recognition, even so, that Germany's aggression in France and Belgium was substantial and serious. So that the First World War for Germans is in a state of flux, but there is still, I think, a prevailing sense that this is at least a problem that has to be explained. And the Second World War is fundamentally negative. So what I'm trying to illustrate in these very limited and crude pen pictures is just the variety of different attitudes to this conflict on the continent of Europe. For the Russians, a First World War that remains negative, Second World War which is supremely positive. For the Americans, a First World War that is somewhat forgotten, but is seen as a stepping stone to the greatness and heroism of the Second World War. For the French, a positive First World War, a deeply negative Second World War. For the Germans, a problematic First World War and an utterly problematic and unacceptable and negative Second World War. What I also want to stress about continental Europe is that although these countries all have different perceptions of the two conflicts, the one informing the other, views of one conflict informing the other, and although some countries are still deeply attached to their war story, their war narrative, as a fundamental part of their national history, and that's particularly true of Putin's Russia. Some continental countries have moved on from an obsession with the two world wars. And that is particularly the case for France and Germany. Although it's a rather unfashionable way to put it, it seems to me that the Treaty of Rome in 1957, in other words, the treaty that created the European Economic Community, was in certain respects the peace treaty for Western Europe that drew a line under the Second World War. There wasn't a formal peace treaty. The Allies, the wartime Allies, couldn't agree on what to do with Germany, and that was at the heart of the ensuing Cold War. And the question of Eastern Europe was certainly a matter of fundamental dispute. But as far as France and Germany were concerned, the Treaty of Rome was a way of these two countries coming together and drawing a line not only under the Second World War, but under a cycle of wars that took you back several centuries in European history. Back to 1914, back to 1870, to 1806, back to the wars of Louis XIV. This was the rhythm of Franco-German history. And what those two countries decided to do in 1957, only 12 years after the end of the, less than 12 years after the end of the Second World War, was to draw a line under this, and in a sense say, if you can't beat them, join them. Work together. And I think it's underestimated in this country the amazing character, amazing nature of that bouleversement, that complete transformation in attitudes that came about in these two countries. To give you an illustration of it in human terms, in 1958, Charles de Gaulle comes to power as President of France. Konrad Adenauer has been Chancellor of Germany for 9 years, since 1949. These two men need to meet. De Gaulle was not a fan of the European community. If he'd had his way, he wouldn't have signed the treaty, but it had already happened before he came to power. It's now a fait accompli. He has to deal with it. He has to deal with Adenauer. De Gaulle spent half of the First World War in a German prisoner of war camp. Adenauer's first visit to Paris was to see the German delegation at the Paris Peace Conference just before it was forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles. So, not happy omens on either side, and of course de Gaulle had been the leader of fighting France against Nazi Germany in the Second War. Adenauer is driven from Bonn across the old battlefields of the First World War and earlier wars, and he reflects rather gloomily on this whole situation. What he doesn't realize is that he has been invited to de Gaulle's home at Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, right out on the eastern edge of France, in the country. What he doesn't realize is that that is a real gesture on the part of this very private Frenchman. No other foreign statesman, foreign leader, was ever hosted by de Gaulle in his personal home. Winston Churchill was once invited, interestingly enough. He wasn't able to come, but Adenauer is the only head of state, head of government to come. And when he finally gets to Colombey, he discovers de Gaulle is a really warm and approachable host. De Gaulle still has a good deal of German from his time in the prisoner of war camp. They get rid of the interpreters quite quickly. De Gaulle persuades Adenauer he is serious about a new relationship between France and Germany. Adenauer persuades de Gaulle that he is a German who wants to move on, who wants to bind Germany into the West and into a new relationship. And a few years later, they signed the Élysée Treaty in 1963, which creates a new, fundamentally new bilateral Franco-German relationship, not just at the top, but also for ordinary people, for exchanges between towns in the two countries, exchanges between school groups, building a new attitude in new generations. This is a fundamental change. And if we want to understand why the European Union, for all its problems, has a resonance in France and Germany that it does not have here, I think we have to root it in that recognition of the way that that institution enabled these two countries to move on from a cycle of bitter and entrenched hostility, move on from their era of the two world wars. So with that as a preamble, different attitudes on the continent and the way that at least France and Germany have moved on from an obsession with the wars, I want to turn now to Britain. (1914-18) is the worst war in British military history. 750,000 dead. Another 250,000 if you include countries of the Empire and Commonwealth. Coming to terms with that death toll is a huge task. In emotional terms, for the bereaved, and actually in physical terms for the government in dealing with, to put it bluntly, the bodies. Such is the scale of the death toll that a decision is made very quickly that the dead will not be brought home. They will be buried where they've fallen, or at least near where they've fallen, in graves established by what became the Commonwealth or the Imperial War Graves Commission, and which you can see, of course, as you go along the Western Front. Something like 1,000 cemeteries and memorials along the Western Front from the Belgian coast down deep into France. What people thought of the conflict initially is hard to say. After such an appalling tragedy, people want to move on. There is a need to come to terms with one's own grief as bereaved relatives, but much of that is done in private. What you get just at certain moments is a flash of a sense of how powerful the feelings were. For example, when the cenotaph was opened, was inaugurated, first as a temporary structure in the summer of 1919 and then as a permanent structure a year later, the outpouring of emotion was palpable. The flowers that were laid feet deep around the base of Lutyens' cenotaph, something we take for granted, a building we take for granted, or edifice we take for granted now in Whitehall, but one that had a peculiar power for people at the time to move beyond simply Christian notions of sacrifice and death towards something more abstract, almost an empty space on which people could project their own emotions and their own feelings. But for the most part, the war, people, in a sense, internalize it, people move on. In the late 1920s, you begin to see more of a discussion about what the conflict was actually like. Because remember, this is not a 21st century war. This is not one that you can see on the internet every day. It's not with soldiers. It's not filmed by soldiers at the time with their own mobile phones. It's not tweeted from the battlefields or anything like that. It remains, its raw reality remains very difficult for people on the home front to appreciate. In the late 1920s, around, I think, the 10th anniversary of the armistice, writings begin to come out which give you at least a sense or an impression of what the soldier experience was like. They're slightly contrived pieces of writing. Siegfried Sassoon's autobiography, Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That. Or, for example, R.C. Sherriff's play, Journey's End, which is one of the great West End successes of 1930. Against all the odds. I mean, this is a play that really has no romantic interest, very little action. It's basically a lot of men sitting around, often half-drunk, bickering with each other and arguing. Yet, it riveted audiences, and people said again and again, this is the first time I've kind of understood the reality of war. And also it had a profound effect on people's sense of the need for peace. J.B. Priestley, the author, he said, "This is the most powerful plea for peace I know." And what I would suggest is that in the early 1930s, the idea of peace as the most sincere form of remembrance becomes the sort of theme of the way the British tried to come to terms with the First World War. 750,000 dead, all this bereavement, all this suffering, all the wounded, all those people you didn't really talk about who are victims of psychological damage, the kind of figures that are there in, Mrs. Dalloway and so on in the back. You could sort of justify it to a country that has not had the experience of continental war in the way that our neighbours have done in the 20th century or the 19th century. If you could say, yes, this is the war to end war, if this was the last war, then it might be justified. And it's no accident, I think, that the British have the largest and most vociferous and energetic peace movement in the world, I think, in the 1930s. Because trying to ensure that this is the world is kept at peace is so fundamental to trying to justify the sacrifice of the last war. The Peace Ballot of 1935, which is now regarded as a sort of footnote or even a rather farcical enterprise in British history of the 1930s, nearly over a third of the population actually sign petitions that support the League of Nations, support the outlawing of weapons of international armaments, committing themselves to trying to ensure that the conflict, a conflict of that sort, will not repeat itself. But then, of course, comes September 1939. And the War of 39-45 has the effect, I think, of turning the doubts and the problems about 1418 in British memory into something that becomes very clearly a negative story. It becomes a negative story if you contrast the story of World War II as it has emerged for us now in a almost classic Churchillian narrative. So this is a war, unlike the last one, where British home territory is threatened, when cities like London are bombed, heavily bombed, much more than in the Great War, when there's a real threat of invasion in 1940, where there is a sense, as Churchill put it, that Britain is fighting on alone, when France has collapsed, in what he calls Britain's finest hour, a phrase which has become central to the way we describe that whole conflict. Then you go on to the end of the war. The war ends, unlike the last one, in Germany's unconditional surrender. Not an armistice signed with German troops still on French and Belgian soil, but an unconditional surrender, a Nazi regime that is destroyed and Allied troops in Berlin itself. And then also, in contrast with the equivocations about the rights and wrongs of 1418, you have, as the war ends, the opening up of the Nazi camps, Belsen and Buchenwald both having a huge effect on radio audiences in this country, in the United States. Richard Dimbleby's broadcast from Belsen, Ed Murrow's from Buchenwald. The magnitude of the extermination camps in the East, Auschwitz, less clear at this stage to British and American audiences. They were opened up by the Russians. But nevertheless, a clear sense that this was an evil regime that we defeated, unequivocally evil. So that the war for us becomes very clearly a heroic narrative, our finest hour ending up in total victory and the defeat of an utterly bestial regime. Very different from the narrative, the problematic narrative of what the First War had done, what the cost was and what had been achieved. And in the 1950s, of course, the story of the Second World War is replayed again and again in heroic mode on the movie screen. It's more than 100 colour movies that are produced by British studios, celebrating usually stiff upper lip British heroes, or English heroes really mostly, fighting the evil Nazis without many allies hanging around in the corners. Jack Hawkins, Richard Todd, Dam Busters, those sorts of films. And those films are then replayed repeatedly on British television in the 70s, 80s, and indeed up till the present day. I think if you look on BBC Two on the quiet hours of 1 p.m. or something like that, there's probably a war movie on it at that sort of point. And so this has had a significant effect in etching a view of the war into British memory. It's not until the 1960s that the First World War comes out of the shadows. 20 years on from the end of the First World War, 1965, of course, the year of Churchill's death, and regarded by many people that as a sort of moment of transition for British history. But 64 to 68 are the years in which the 50th anniversary of the war is commemorated. Remember, there wasn't really a 25th anniversary commemoration because that was occluded by 1939-45. The 25th anniversary would have been August 1939, when understandably people had other things on their mind than thinking about the last war. So 50th anniversary is when the memorial, the anniversary culture really bites home. And one of the things I found in writing the book was that I think the anniversary moments are tremendously important for stimulating public debate and also stimulating debate amongst historians. And that's true of this centenary anniversary as well. In the 1960s, what do you get? You get an increasingly negative view of the conflict. This is when the phrase popularized by Alan Clark about lions led by donkeys becomes a kind of bon mot for characterizing the war. In other words, a bunch of stupid generals, boneheaded generals, and a bunch of willing sacrificial victims, the British Tommy. That is captured in books, but also above all in Joan Littlewood's Theatre Workshop production, Oh, What a Lovely War, which then becomes an international movie success in the film that's directed by Richard Attenborough. You've also got at the same time the growing interest in family history and history from the bottom up, which focuses on the experience of individual soldiers rather than the antics of generals and politicians. Here, a book that has huge effect and imitation is Martin Middlebrook's First Day on the Somme. Martin Middlebrook is an amateur historian. He was an egg farmer in Lincolnshire. He was fascinated by the First World War. He'd, as he said, never written anything much longer than a business letter before, since he'd left school. But he got into doing this. He interviewed a lot of veterans of that first day. He produced something which was a very powerful piece of popular grassroots history. He went on to do a whole lot of other books like that on different wars, but he encouraged a lot of emulators. So a view of the war from the bottom up, from the ordinary soldier's experience. And also, perhaps above all, this is when, in the 1960s, it's when the poets really take their grip on the British national imagination in a way that is simply not true of any other country. I say the poets, but actually it's probably only about half a dozen poets. The ones that are familiar to us now from the O-level or GCSE curriculum, people like Rupert Brooke, generally presented as the kind of voice of naive patriotism at the beginning of the war. Darker voices, Rosenberg, perhaps Isaac Rosenberg, but certainly Siegfried Sassoon, the anger of Sassoon in the middle of the war as the conflict and the cost becomes apparent. And then supremely Wilfred Owen, the poet who evokes the pity of war, and of course symbolically dies a week before the armistice to show up, if you like, the complete futility of the conflict. These are the voices that are now remembered and articulated again and again at memorial services. Yet there were, in fact, something like 2,200 people who wrote poetry about the Great War during the Great War. Some of them only perhaps one piece that got into the Times, but others who wrote a substantial amount. And it's worth remembering that of those 2,200, 25% were, 60% were 80% were civilians, and 25% were women. The first anthology of women's poetry of the Great War did not appear until the 1980s. These were voices that were screened out because it was assumed that the essential voice of the Great War, the great essential poetic voice of the Great War, was that of a junior officer on the Western Front. Usually somebody who was complexed about his own courage and his own masculinity. The result is often very powerful poetry, but it's not clear that it's representative poetry, nor is it necessarily a clear insight into the experience of soldiers on the Western Front, taken as a whole. Anyway, so this is the 1960s is when the elements of what I take to be still our broad public perception of the Great War take hold. A struggle of immense futility, run at the top by men who really were not up to the job, involving sacrifice of soldiers on an appalling scale. A subject either for tragedy or for satire, as in the case of Oh, What a Lovely War, and interpreted supremely not by historians but by poets, a few poets in particular. So for us, this is a story of the two wars in which the Second World War is engraved in national memory now as our finest hour. And 1914-18 is hugely problematic, a tragedy that really can only be explained or come to terms with not as history, but as poetry, or, as we've seen in the last few weeks, as poppies, as images that evoke a sense of pain and loss, but without really grappling with the underlying historical meanings and historical explanations of this conflict and this experience. So I've suggested that all our countries that I've mentioned today have looked at the First World War in the light of the Second, but they've come to different conclusions about the relationship, and that some countries have managed to move on to some extent from the era of the two world wars, particularly France and Germany. It doesn't seem to me that this country has found it so easy to move on from the era of the two world wars. It certainly has not found the European Union to be the kind of device for moving on that the French and the Germans have managed to do. Remember that we entered the European community late, 15 years after it had been created. That wasn't necessarily as desired, but de Gaulle imposed 2 vetoes in the 1960s, which delayed British entry, delayed it until the time when, if you like, the basic form of the European community, the original 6, had set firm. The basic deals between those countries, particularly France and Germany, had set firm. And anybody entering then, as Britain, Denmark, and Ireland did in 1973, had to accept those rules of the game, even if they were not particularly suited to some of Britain's economic interests. So the common agricultural policy, for example, the budget, these were not necessarily ideal for Britain economically, but there were real political reasons for getting in, particularly if otherwise the alternative would be marginalization in the whole transatlantic relationship with the United States, that we would no longer be taken seriously if there was a substantial European voice on the continent. But since then, we have remained, in many ways, an awkward partner within the European Union, not just in the days of Mrs. Thatcher, but right up to the present, taking a different attitude on issues that have been engraved now in the approach and the policy of the European Union and of the European Commission. And of course, we are now faced with the possibility in 2017 of a referendum on Britain's continued membership of the European Union, a prospect that's been accentuated by the rise in recent months of the UK Independence Party. And I think this whole debate about Europe now is linked up with our own problematic memory of those two world wars. The First World War, as I say, seen as a tragic sacrifice, a war on foreign soil that lost 750,000 men for reasons that are not easy to understand. Why did we enter it? Why was it not decisive in 1918? A Second World War that is regarded as heroic and noble, but was won mostly, as far as the British are concerned, not with continental allies, but with the support of what Churchill called the English-speaking peoples. In other words, the United States, the countries of the Commonwealth, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, India, of course, but less often mentioned. The English-speaking peoples. So a war in which victory accentuates, in a way, our sense of distance from the continent, the 1940 divide. And we have not found the European community, as I say, the European Union, a way of moving on from those two conflicts. It's often said that the Germans have spent the last 50 years struggling to come to terms with, to master their past. I think in the 21st century, we in Britain have a real challenge to understand how we are going to master our own 20th century past. Thank you very much.